Hi, folks. Welcome to Rotary Speaks. It's where the conversation doesn't stop when the TED Talk ends. This new program, crafted exclusively for Rotarians, takes you on a journey from the microscopic to the galactic, from timeless classical arts to the pulse of today's music. Each talk is designed to inspire, provoke thought, and spark action, leaving you amazed and energized. And the best part, these talks will be recorded and shared, amplifying their impact across the global Rotary community. Get ready to discover, connect, and be moved. Now, for today, picture this. You're standing in front of your closet. Do you grab the sport jacket, knowing it might make you look too formal? Or maybe you're weighing a big decision like whether to take that intriguing but tough class, knowing it might ding your GPA. Or even asking yourself the biggest question of all, is it time to retire? Well, every day we face decisions, big and small, but have you ever stopped to wonder how your brain really makes those choices? Is it a logical process, or do thoughts march around like little soldiers fighting for dominance? Well, today we're diving into the neuroscience of decision making with an expert who's truly unforgettable. Our speaker is a cognitive neuroscientist and the chief science officer at Corporate Visions. She's also the founder of Enhansive, an agency that helps organizations harness the power of neuroscience to create memorable and impactful content. She's the author of two highly regarded books, Impossible to Ignore and Made You Look, and a faculty member at Stanford University, where she teaches how to create content that sticks in people's mind and drives them to action. After all, memory only matters if it leads to action, right? So please join me in giving a warm, indelible Rotary welcome to Dr. Carmen Simon.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. It is great to be back, and I have a few thoughts to share along with practical guidelines that will connect to the missions that your club holds dear, starting with, if you remember from the last time, we were talking about the notion of how fun it is to talk about the brain. And the reason it is so fun is because everybody has one. And sometimes when I make that remark, people giggle because you may not see the evidence of it. But it's true, everyone that you're talking to has a brain, and it's important to understand how it works. And before we get to see some practical guidelines around how the brain makes decisions, do you remember the reason we have a brain? We were reflecting on that last time that we got together. What's the reason we have a brain?
Memory.
Ooh, I like where you're going. And that's a profound reason, because it will be very difficult to survive, which I think that some of you are thinking that's one of the reasons we have a brain, so we can ultimately survive. In that survival, we'll have to remember a lot of things. This is why some diseases that are plaguing our way of remembering are so devastating. So I like how you're tying the brain, the existence of the brain, with memory. Why else do we have a brain?
Survival.
Ultimately, it is to survive. And I'm sure that in that survival, you're thinking that we might be doing some other things, such as communicating and thinking and feeling. And we process a lot of things, like David is saying here in the chat box. And all of these answers are correct. And what ties all of your answers together is the most basic reason for which we have a brain. We have a brain so we can move, physically move. A brain that doesn't move is not a brain that can process things. It's not a brain that can remember. It is ultimately not a brain that can survive. I am very grateful, by the way, that this morning you had a few choices in movement, and you decided to come to this location, or you decided to sit in front of the computer and move in that direction so that you can learn a few things. We have a brain so we can move. And what we know is that from the brain's perspective, the most important move is really the next move. What happens next is the brain's priority. This is where decisions come into play, because where you decide to move will be critical to survival. And of course, we can look at movement in a physical aspect. We can look at movement in a metaphorical aspect. But what happens next is very critical. And of course, there is no movement that the brain makes or will ever make unless there is memory involved. And luckily, there isn't an infinite amount of ways in which we decide where to move next. What is our next move? There are only three pathways to decision making. So for the rest of the session, let's look at some practical guidelines that we can associate with these three pathways to decisions. And when I mention here the science of your next move, this could be the next move that you make for yourself, but can also be the next move that you inspire others to make. And I know that you have quite a few areas of focus, such as inspiring others to make the right move in education or in developing communities or developing the economy or in preventing diseases or resolving conflict. All of those will be tied to these pathways to decision making. And as we look through these, you'll recognize that you'll be able to resonate with them very easily. So, for instance, if we know that the brain has some pre-wired memories, for instance, to which it decides what to move next in a reflexive way, that will be easy to understand why, as you're about to approach a hot surface, you know exactly what to move next, which is away from it, because thousands of years of evolution have been teaching us that skin is instrumental to our survival. So we have some automatic behaviors that are already commanding the brain and body where to move next. Then we can also make decisions where to move next based on some habits that we form. Unlike reflexes, habits are conscious at first, such as deciding what is the most optimal route for you to take to go to work or to show up to the Rotary meeting for this morning. And once you decide that route that treats you well each time and proves to be rewarding each time, then you tend to fall on autopilot. In fact, if you ever go to the same route somewhere, let's just say to an office, and then there comes a weekend and you want to go somewhere else, and you're almost very tempted to go to the exact same route just because it has become so habitual for you. Habits are very juicy to the brain because once we set them, we don't have to exert so much cognitive effort. However, the human species would not evolve if we only abided by reflexes and habits, and that's how we make all of our decisions. At some point, we have to exert some cognitive effort, and we make decisions based on some goals that we set for ourselves. So, for example, if the goal is to make it to work on time, but now there's construction on that habitual route to work, at some point you will change your mind in light of new information. Unlike reflexes and habits over here, goals will definitely tax your cognitive capacity a lot more, which is why quite often, given the brain to think or not to think, what do we prefer? We choose the previous two. In business content, which is where most of my work resides, I'm noticing that there's the balances are not there in terms of how much we tax the brain, because we like to appeal to people's goals and to give them goals and to give them more goals. Here are some new resolutions as the year has started. So sometimes we err on the side of making people think too much and taxing the brain also often. I speak about the brain and I speak about neuroscience from my experiences. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and what that means in my world is that I use various tools, such as the ones that you see here on the screen, through which I investigate what happens in the brain and body when people are exposed to business content. In fact, I'm just in the middle of a neuroscience study right now, so you can see the cap that you're seeing here on the screen in real life. So I'm about to place this on people. That's why I have the hard stop. The next participant shows up here at 8 o'clock Pacific for you. I'm here in Dallas right now. And I am studying, by the way, how the brain reacts to AI tools. What else, given the current times? The stimulus differs. So in here, you can see a picture of somebody going through an experiment where they're looking at a sales presentation that's appearing here on the screen. This was a sales presentation on cybersecurity. And I'm curious to see what happens as people are exposed to a stimulus. The stimulus can be digital like this. It could be digital like an AI tool. It can be sometimes physical, like people interacting with objects. Through the EEG cap that I place on the scalp, the one that you just saw, I get to record the brain waves that are generated in reaction to the stimulation that they're exposed to. On the chest, I place an electrode that enables me to capture a heart rate. So you can see the electrodes. If you've ever had an EKG in the hospital, it's exactly the same signal that I get, except they call it by the sexier German name. On the wrist and fingers, you're seeing this other device this is so fun for me because usually I just share the slide, but now that I'm in the middle of the study, I can show you the actual physical devices. So you can see on his wrist, there is this device that's called the GSR. It has these two sensors that go on the fingers. And with this, what I'm able to capture is how the skin changes as you have a reaction to a stimulus. So for instance, for my experiment right now with AI, I will get to see if people have a reaction. It can be positive or negative. I won't know, but I will know that the skin has changed as a result of that reaction. And on the computer itself, there's an eye tracker. I'm enjoying seeing what people see because there's a connection between visual attention and cognitive processing. And typically you look to where you think. So I like to know what that connection is. And what does that give us? And what are some consequences for you listening to this? I get to see where people pay attention and for how long, whether they can retain something online until they complete a cognitive task. In most of my cases, the cognitive task is to pay as much attention to a presentation or to an AI tool and see what people remember later on. You're more likely to be remembered later on and people deciding in your favor if they remember you now. So this is what working memory enables us to do. Then I get to see people get more or less fatigued if they're motivated to keep going. So these four variables you're seeing here are on the cognitive side. The last two variables that you're seeing here are on the affective side. Valence means how much people enjoy an experience, and arousal in this context means how alert and awake they are during that experience. Sometimes people may not be also alert and awake, especially as they interact with some business presentations. Not things that you do, but things that we've seen other people do. And David, regarding your question here in the chat box around the skin changes, the conductivity of your skin changes. So you're likely to sweat a little bit more as you have a strong reaction to something. In fact, people have started to use these GSR devices and these sensors on light detection tests more recently. I like the combination of these tools, by the way, versus using one or two, because if I was only using an eye tracker, for instance, and I was noticing that people were looking more here in the upper right corner of a screen versus the lower left, unless I had some other devices such as the ECG, the EEG, and the GSR, I wouldn't necessarily know if people are looking more intently in an area because they're confused or because they're interested. And I don't want to ask them some questions because what these devices enabled me to do is to get to implicit reactions from brain and body. So for example, if I asked you, how much do you like interacting with an AI tool? And you would tell me, I don't know if I can fully trust those answers, those self-reports, because sometimes people tell you what they think you want to hear. Sometimes the way that you ask a question can influence the answer. So there's a difference between me saying, do you like using AI tools versus do you get apprehensive about using AI tools? So you see, in the way that I ask the question, I'm almost leading you towards an answer. Whereas with these tools that you're seeing here on the screen, I bypass self-reports. I don't have to ask questions for the specific variables that you're seeing here. These are not mind-reading devices. I wish they were. If they were, no one would be here at this meeting right now. We would all be sipping cocktails in the tropics because we would have understood the brain so well that there is no mystery left. So now that you know how some of these observations are born and where they come from and the studies that I do, let's look at some practical guidelines that you can use as early as this afternoon, and you can very quickly tie them to the areas of focus that are important to you. Let's start with reflexes. As scientists, we have established a list of biologically autonomous behaviors, let's call them that, things that elicit an automatic reaction from all of you, no exception. This is universal. So for example, we know that you will have a reaction to sweet taste, bitter taste, odors, specific temperatures, youth, crime instants, snakes, aesthetics in general, physical touch, of course, altruism, controlling our environment. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is enough to give you a sense that for some items, the brain already comes with some pre-wired mechanisms for survival. So either you want to approach these or you want to withdraw from this, but the reaction is universal. And as you're seeing this list, I want to remind all of us that these are called primary reinforcers, meaning that they're not learned, they're already wired. You can contrast them with secondary reinforcers, such as money or promotions, for instance. Those two will drive the brain and body toward movement and toward a reaction. But those behaviors are learned. Money and promotions are learned, quite often based on some arbitrary associations, versus these are primary ones. We know people will react reflexively to any of these. And I have selected from this list three that you can very quickly associate with things that are important to you, whether professionally or personally. Sometimes you might think, well, I can't really associate sex with everything that I do, or I can't associate snakes with everything that I do. But these three that I picked, I know for a fact that you can indeed embed them in the way that you communicate with others. And they will be based on memories that already exist in the brain. So take, for instance, this notion of controlling the environment. Even as you're watching my screen, I'm very impressed with people who can create artifacts that are alluding to this notion of control. And some of them are created on a lighthearted type of foundation, such as the one that you see here. But you see how very cleverly they announce to us that if we can provide some notion of control, then you can be better off. So as you're listening to this principle, for the next time that you're communicating something to someone, see if you can promise them that as they partner with you, as they listen to you, as they start believing in your ideas or your products or your services, anything you have to offer. It doesn't always have to be a physical thing. It can be a conceptual thing, such as an idea. Remind your audiences that when they do that, they can be in better control of their own environment. Do you guys remember Brexit? It seems like ages ago, but I suspect that one of the reasons why they were successful with that mission is because what was the mantra of that mission? It was take back control. The moment that you promise the brain control, you have a reflexive reaction from that brain. It's the same with the notion of altruism. Notice what happens to your brain right now if I said, it's raining outside and I bought an umbrella for myself, versus it's raining outside and I bought an umbrella for someone else. Do you see how your reaction is different? This is because we're recognizing that ours is a social species. We don't survive as individuals. We survive as communities. In fact, I know that a community focus is one of your 7 areas of focus. So the way to embed this in your communication and to allude to it is to say to your audiences, when you partner with us, when you listen to us, or to me, if you're speaking as one person, if you're buying into things that I have to say, you will be in better service to someone else. You always, always in life or in business will have audiences with audiences. If you can promise your primary one that when they partner with you, they can be in better service with somebody else, you will have an instant reaction from the brain. For any of you who are still on LinkedIn, if you may remember a post that was done a few years back, there was this teacher who was teaching a night class. And a student showed up with her toddler because she didn't find a babysitter. And this toddler cried just nonstop throughout the first part of the session. And people were starting to get a little bit antsy. Remember, in the list of reflexive behaviors, crying infants is one of those behaviors that your brain and body will react to instantly. It's a pre-wired mechanism. So this teacher had a choice. He had the choice to tell her to leave because she was disrupting the rest of the class, or what he did instead, he took the toddler in his own arms because he had experience with small children, and he taught the rest of the class that way. Altruism at its best, 85,000 likes and thousands of reposts later. That's the impact of altruism. So allude to that in your messages. And the third reflexive behavior that you can rely on is that can be founded on an aesthetic message, on something that is perceived as beautiful. And as you're listening to this notion of aesthetic, perhaps some of you are thinking, well, isn't beauty in the eyes of the beholder? And to a certain degree, that's true. There is a subjective dimension to beauty. In fact, I would love to know some of your answers to this question. What is something that is ordinary to others, but beautiful to you? What would you say? If you reflect on your environment, I'm sure there are things or people that you find more aesthetically pleasing than others? What is that for you? And sometimes when I ask that question, people will say, well, my dog is beautiful, whereas if other people were looking at the dog, may not necessarily think so. In fact, do you ever guys see those sites where they post pictures of pets that are so ugly that they are cute? Because some people, luckily for the world, will find beauty in almost anything, and that's just it's just so endearing. What is ordinary to others but beautiful to you?
To your question, what is ordinary to other people? Stratification in rocks, I think, is fascinating.
I like that. Anything else?
Yeah, I would say there are certain passages of music that move me deeply, and other people can listen to it and just goes right past them.
It's a strong answer, and music in general and music genres are so subjective. I'm sure that some people will listen to some music genres. For those of you who have children, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You may be listening to somebody else's music, and you may think that's what you're into. Speaking of somebody else's preferences, do you ever come across somebody else's Netflix profile? Like even if you're sharing profiles with your spouse or somebody else in your house and you accidentally click on their icon and then their preferences show up at the top and you're thinking those are the shows that you're into. There's a subjective nature to beauty at some point. When I ask this question, what is ordinary to others but beautiful to you? I always enjoy answers like yours. Stratification and rocks, I think, is a solid answer. Some music passages, I love that. I remember somebody saying they considered Tupperware beautiful, for example. And I remember somebody else saying they found the crunchy noise that you experience when you're stepping on leaves absolutely beautiful. Somebody said that they like it when somebody else mispronounces their name, because when that happens, it's almost like a remix of your identity. I like what David is saying here in the chat box, a group of bicyclists riding through curving mountain roads. This is very poetic. So thank you so much for these answers. Somebody said, speaking of Netflix, that they found it beautiful when sometimes they're watching foreign films and there are some mismatched subtitles with what the person is saying or doing. There is a subjective nature to beauty. However, there's also some universal dimensions to beauty. And these are the ones that I would like to invite you to reflect on, because you can very quickly tie them to the way you communicate with others and tie them to your areas of focus. And these universal ones that you see here displayed on the screen, I think you'll find them fairly intuitive in what they are. But what I'm observing from the neuroscience experiments that I conduct is that anytime you include any or all of these, you will engage somebody else's brain for longer, and you'll convince them to want to return to your information. Do you realize what luxury it is these days to convince someone to stay with you longer and want to return to what you have to say? Pure luxury. Proximity, simply grouping like ideas together. Dominance, meaning that you're showing somebody else's brain that something is indeed a bit more important, very similar to hierarchy right here. There's something that is a message that resides at the top. And if you clarify for somebody else's brain what is a subset of that message, they will find that appealing. Also, when things are presented in a fairly amount of balance, so you're not just insisting on some things more so than other things. And communication feels like it's coming part of the same context, the same foundation. It doesn't feel like it's being mismatched or put together at the last minute. The brain will detect that. I purposefully left contrast for the last spot here because I want to give you a percentage. Sometimes people will say, I want to differentiate myself from others, especially if you're still in business, that would be one of your goals. Or sometimes you may want to appeal to somebody else's brain to say, you want to do this more so than this other thing. Like I know preventing disease, for instance, is one of your areas of focus. You might have to convince someone to say, go and adopt these methods versus these other methods. The more contrast there is between status quo and an aspiration, the more likely the brain is to move in that direction. But contrast, in order to have impact, has to be perceived. Quite often people don't change their status quo because they don't perceive enough contrast between what is and what could be. What's that percentage? I want to give you a number here. So that's 30%. In order for the brain to perceive that, for instance, something is small versus something is large, something is quiet versus something is loud, there has to be at least a 30% difference between those items. So for the next time that you want to build contrast in somebody else's brain, make sure that that is perceivable. I thought I heard a breath. Was somebody going to ask a question, or did you have something to remark? I can stop at any time. Overall, what you're seeing here on my screen are some other artifacts from people's communication that abide by those aesthetic principles that I was mentioning. You can see how any of these elements that you're seeing here will have some contrast, will have some unity, will have some balance. Sometimes the contrast comes from some conceptual things that you're saying. So for instance, if your future is here for the shaping, perhaps you may not have heard those words exactly the same. So there may be contrast between what you thought you would see and what you're actually seeing. There's perceptual contrasting here between how small he is and how large the environment is. I'm enjoying this piece of communication from someone's presentation in terms of the grayscale versus the color. Conceptually, you can deviate from reality just partially, like you're saying that they're doing here in this piece of communication. And of course, these aesthetic principles don't always have to apply to visual communication. They can apply to the way that you talk to people on the phone. So even as you're having a verbal conversation, you can group like things, like ideas together. And that's what gives this notion of proximity. It's like, I know what you're talking about because they're related to, these ideas are related to each other. So don't feel like you always have to have visuals all the time. But as we're reflecting on these reflexes, just know that anytime you include them in your communication, you will have a subconscious reflexive reaction from the brain, meaning that you're not taxing people all so much. And speaking of not taxing people all so much, it's the same for habits. We're thinking about habits at first, but after a while, we don't have to reflect on them and we don't have to exert cognitive energy. In fact, I'd love to know what some of your habits are. I know that all of you attending the session have some habits. Some are treating you well, some are not treating you so well. Let's start with the good ones. What are some good habits that you have developed over the years? What is treating you well these days? And you would even like to share with others? What would you say?
Leaving home and getting outside as much as possible to enjoy nature.
Ooh, I like that a lot because we were just talking about the fact that we have a brain so we can move. So the fact that you're leaving the house and enjoying the outdoors, that means you're putting the brain to good use. That's a very inspirational answer. Thank you for that.
Making my bed every morning.
I like that also. Do you guys remember that talk that was given by a general, I think it was? It was supposed to be very motivational, and he was reminding us that we did nothing but made our bed every day. That already is like a big deal. So thank you for that answer. Anybody else with good habits?
Religiously flossing and brushing 2 times a day.
Another good habits that we can all adopt, and I'm sure that people around you are also very grateful for you having that habit. Now let's go the other way. What are some temptations that you try very hard to resist? What are some of your bad habits that you can disclose publicly?
Take the rest of the day for that one.
This qualifies both ways, but
There were a lot of smart aleck remarks until you asked the question.
Tuning out of a conversation or a situation that bores you.
Ooh, so that's actually very profound, because if you're tuning out from a boring conversation, I wonder why this is actually a very interesting answer, because as we're tuning out, we can probably save our brain from some misery. But I wonder why would it be it's a temptation, because we're going inward and we're saying, I don't need to be part of this. And perhaps if we went the other way around, if we tried a little bit harder and really focus on the other person, maybe that would give some satisfaction to both parties. I will be thinking about your answer a lot, because it's so easy for the brain to retreat inwards. In fact, even as I do the neuroscience studies, by the way, anytime that I expose somebody to a stimulus, I'm not sure if we talked about this last time that we met, before I even show them anything, whether it's a presentation or whether it's the AI tool for today, before the experiment starts, I ask them to stare at a beige wall or at a beige screen. In fact, in here, you can see that I have the beige wall right next to me. And the reason that I want to do that is because I want to see what the brain is like in an unstimulated state. And then I can compare that baseline with what happens in the brain when I'm giving them something to be stimulated with. So the beige wall would be the equivalent of that boring conversation that you're talking about. And what I'm noticing is that quite often, by the way, business communication doesn't beat the beige wall, meaning that there is no statistically significant difference between people staring at this and looking at a piece of business content. Kind of sad. But this is why we're here. We're here to improve things. But what I'm also noticing is that when the brain goes inward, the eye gets bored for quite a bit, but then inward, there's a lot of buzz going on. There's a lot of complexity. So the fact that we're retreating doesn't necessarily mean that we're always doing ourselves justice, because guess what? That internal buzz that you have, about 2/3 of it is fairly often negative. So retreating doesn't always put us in a better mood than if we were to keep attending to that conversation. So thank you for that profound answer. Anybody else with like some really bad habits?
Yeah, I'm working very hard in the recent years to avoid over-explaining, jumping into correct something. And also what's come to be called mansplaining.
You guys are coming up with some really profound ones. Thank you for that. And I'm conflicted as I'm listening to this, because I'm enjoying them from a brain science perspective, just like the mind wandering example was previously. Yours is an intriguing one, because more often I'm noticing how the brain can stay tuned a little bit more when things become complex and not simple. So I would say, as long as you achieve a balance between the elaboration and the explanations, you will be good, because the good news for you is that the brain is likely to tune in and synchronize a bit more with that which is complex and does have the elaboration and the extra explanations, versus something that is simple and may border on simplistic, therefore boring, which is tied to the previous answer that we heard. I'm really enjoying your answers. I wish we had more time so we can reflect on this. So thank you for what you're sharing. The point that we're making that will tie to a practical guideline is this: the moment that we start creating some of these habits, whether they are on the good side, such as the dental flossing, or on the tricky side, such as I don't want to deal with boring conversations, or I don't want to over-explain things, or perhaps social media and sugar might be some of our bad habits. Initially, you consciously make those habits, but after a while, when they prove rewarding to your brain, you tend to go there again and again without exerting too much cognitive effort. And we have learned so much from a brain science perspective in terms of habits and even where they're housed in the brain, or some of them are housed in the brain. Do you guys ever feel a vibration on your leg and your phone is not even in your pocket? For those of you who answered yes, we know exactly where that habit is housed. It's in this region on the brain of the brain. Obviously, this region does a few more other things, but that's what I mean. We have learned so much, and we can pinpoint so much about habitual behavior. When it comes to communication, we can bring in some of these neuroscience findings that we have. So, for instance, we know that the brain is more likely to tune into something new when it's linked to something that it has seen or done before. So I'm impressed with this company that was obviously advertising their brand of tea. Perhaps some of you may be familiar with them. But notice how very cleverly they're doing it, because for those who are not familiar with this brand of tea, familiar objects, they're not hitting them with novelty all at once. So whenever you have the chance, especially as you're reflecting on your area of focus, link to what people already know. I'm impressed with this person who wrote this book. Perhaps some of you may have seen the book, perhaps some of you may have read it. She doesn't have it easy in the book because she's attempting to do something that is fairly difficult, which is to define the psychological processes that you're seeing here on the screen. They may seem easy on the surface, but just like you're talking about mind wandering, or you're talking about overly explaining things or the elaboration, there's some layers or some nuances to that, yet she does it so beautifully. This is her definition of anxiety. I'll give you a few moments to fully appreciate what she's doing here, because the way that we link this to this notion of habitual behavior is, you may not necessarily understand this word fully, but when you're talking about somebody kissing you on the forehead, you can picture the kissing, you can picture the forehead, you can picture having a headache for a prolonged amount of time that's excruciating. You see how she's linking something that may be foreign to you to something that feels familiar to your brain. This is her definition of compassion. Yet again, a word that is not immediately available to the senses. This is abstract, it is not concrete. Yet when she explains it through the bright sweaters and the slang and the playing of the volleyball, those are things that could be familiar to the brain. This is her definition of despair, and this is how she's looking at anger. So you're taking something that is fairly abstract and you're linking it now to something that is concrete and familiar. Can your communication do that? So the next time you're speaking about any of your 7 areas of focus, anything that you think is important to your audience, take something that you may find that is new to their brain and link it to what they already know. This is her definition of longing, by the way. I like how you're talking about stratification and rocks. See how we can link that to many other things. Link to what they already know. For us in business, and for those of you who may still be operating in some business in some capacity, I remember working with a company a while back. They were a software company. They had gotten bought ever since. But they were presenting their software not by saying, hey, here's a new software that is operating in this new area. At the time, it was called quote to cash. So from the moment you extend a quote to your customers to the moment you get the cash back for that quote, they're promising to automate this journey. And they weren't saying to their customers initially, hey, do you need a software application for this quote to cash business? They're initially saying, do you use Salesforce? And for those of you still in business, if you're looking at my upper left corner here, that icon, that Salesforce icon, which is now recognizable and familiar to so many people in the business area, would be so easily relatable that now something that feels so new all at once doesn't feel so heavy on the brain because you're linking to something that feels familiar. Of course, you can't insist on the familiar all the time because after a while, the brain does habituate and doesn't pay attention anymore. In fact, I'm very curious to know, in your offices or homes, what is something you have habituated to, like you no longer even see it? I'm really sure that in your offices or in your homes, you initially bought some things, like perhaps an interesting painting, or perhaps you bought some piece of furniture, or perhaps you have an amazing view which caught your attention oh so well in the beginning. But now it's just a mundane thing. What is that for you? What is something that you no longer notice in the environment?
Most of the objects in my house fall into that category because they were all purchased by my wife, who loves them and can identify them in her sleep. But I could never tell you what is on this counter or that wall.
And we won't tell her this. I know that this is recorded, but let's just make sure that this recording does not get to some entities. And it's a very candid answer. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And it's no different with your audiences. They too, at first, will pay attention. Like even maybe this morning, if you enter the room and there was some music playing in the background, initially that captures your attention. After a while, it falls into the background. If you have any lights that are buzzing right above you right now, maybe when I say this, you're trying to listen for that, but just a moment ago, you weren't listening to it. They may have caught your attention in the beginning. We habituate so quickly. And by habituation, I mean you initially pay attention, and after a while, that attention decreases and to the point where it's not even there anymore. And there's an evolutionary value to habituation, by the way. Imagine if you couldn't habituate to the sound of your own breathing. You would go crazy. So it's good that the brain habituates. But at some point, you want to jolt people out of their habituation. So what I want to propose is that you link to what people know, and at some point have the courage to play off of the familiar. Like, for instance, if you went to Google and you typed in Mona Lisa variations, you would find her portrayed in all sorts of different ways. And the only reason you may giggle at some of these examples is because you're familiar with the original. When you're reflecting on your years, perhaps that you were operating in business, or for some of you who still are, and you may have used this iceberg metaphor. Are you guys familiar with the iceberg metaphor? Typically, especially if you talk to people in business, they will tell you that whatever the reality is, there's something on the surface that you see, but really what's more critical is something that appears here under the surface and it's not initially visible. This iceberg metaphor has been considered such a cliche. If you went to Google and you typed in the iceberg metaphor, you would find 1 million plus results, which means that's how many people used it. So we are challenging, I run a design agency as well because we apply these neuroscience principles to how content is designed. We're challenging our teams to come up with something else, like go beyond the iceberg metaphor, but keep the story. The story behind it is still important and it's familiar to people. There is more than meets the eyes. There is something that's below the surface that's still important. And you can see how some of our takes came out on the iceberg metaphor to say this notion of there is more to the story than you expected. I'm enjoying this example that you're seeing here because perhaps some of you may be familiar with these sculptures. And we are saying on top of that, there may be a bit more to the story than you expected. The idea is this in terms of practical guidelines. Link to what your audiences already know in any of those 7 areas of focus or in any of the other personal things that you may have to deal with. This works with your spouses too, by the way. Link to what they know. And at some point, if you really want to get their attention and build an element of surprise for the brain, develop the courage to twist the familiar, to play off of it. And as we have a few minutes left, I want to share just some final guidelines around this goal-oriented way of making decisions. Unlike reflexes and habits with goals, you are making people think a little bit more. Very much like I'm making you think a little bit more as you're processing this artifact. It takes you a moment, but then you get it. But in order to get to that aha moment, you would have to exert a little bit more cognitive effort. People and other species also, in order to survive, remember one of you said we have a brain so we can survive. We do know that we have to exert a little bit more effort. Quite often that comes with some cognition in order to secure our next movement and to make sure that our biological fitness is intact. That comes, of course, with our capacities being taxed a little bit more. So then if we know that the brain doesn't always like to think, but at some point it has to think, can we reach a balance? And the answer should be yes, especially if you want people to move in your favor without feeling so overwhelmed. Picture this situation. Imagine that you're sitting at your desk or your home at that counter where you don't see the object on it. And there's a voice. You ever hear that voice that says, I'm creating something sweet? I know that quite often I hear that voice. And then there's another voice that comes in your head and says, a Kit Kat bar would be really good by now, or you can fill in your own brand. But then there's a third voice that you hear that says, can I afford the calories? Which voice do you indulge? The voice that you indulge the most is whatever you have energy left in your brain and body to do. Because some of your behaviors are going to come more automatically than other behaviors. Like, for instance, let's just say that today your session is not going to end at 8 or 8:30. You'll be there for the whole day and you'll have many more sessions and people will tax you and they'll tax you again and again. When you go back home and you open the fridge, what do you reach for? Do you reach for the broccoli or do you reach for the chocolate? I know very few people for whom broccoli is habitual. Usually we reach for the chocolate. You would have to have a lot of willpower and a lot of energy, metabolic energy left in order to make the better choice. I know that preventing diseases is one of your 7 areas of focus and staying healthy. So that's all to say that when you're addressing somebody else's brain, and even when you're dealing with your own brain in terms of making decisions, always wonder how much energy do I have left in there in order to handle some situations? Can I really think my way through this? Often we cannot think our way through this, which is why we have to rely on some habits and some reflexes. But when you're creating communication with someone else, strive for a balance between something that comes automatically and something that comes strategically. For instance, they were our client for a while. I was working with one of their ops divisions, and they wanted to change some of their messages because they wanted to improve their cash flow. Who doesn't these days? And notice how when we're creating their messages, we are striking this balance of something that comes automatically, such as profit. To them, of course, it comes automatically. Serving best is what they wanted to improve. So therefore, that you have to think about it a little bit more. You tax your cognitive capacity a bit more. Creating a customer, they've been doing it for so long, of course, it comes automatically. A customer that creates customers, that we have to think about a little bit more. But you see, at least there is a balance between the two. Can you strike that for yourself, or can you strike that for others? And you'll have an increased chance of the brain moving in your favor, because it doesn't have to be exerted all so much. And as you're making people think, make sure that you're giving them some rewards. Typically, we value things that function or have some emotional value. Epistemology simply means the nature and origin of our knowledge. People like to learn. I'm very impressed with the groups that you have and getting together so often, because you're learning things. Give that to other people and you'll convince them to move in your favor. We already talked about the importance of aesthetics. I'm noticing these days a tendency to go to that which is pleasurable, almost to a fault. So sometimes we have to manage our relationship to pleasure. But the brain enjoys pleasurable things. So can you give that in exchange for the brain thinking in your favor? Sometimes you may have to adjust things based on the situation, like champagne might be appropriate in this context, where wine might be appropriate in this context. But the brain will value that if you took the time to distinguish between some things. Sometimes you may combine some of these rewards or values, but make sure that you are reasonable to somebody else's brain and even to your own. The brain does take bribes. So if you're asking somebody to think and go make decisions in a goal-oriented way, make sure there is a strong reward. And one final principle before I log off is this. I think you'll really enjoy this, because you'll notice that the world is not getting any simpler. The world is getting more complex. And the good news for all of us is that the brain does synchronize with that which is complex. So it's not complexity that gets us in trouble. It is randomness. It is not being able to make it clear to somebody else's brain what is a pattern, what is a short set of rules that I can use in order to complete a task. So for example, let's just say that in 48 hours from now, it will be very important to me that you all remember the string of digits that you see here on the screen. The only way that I can make it a little bit easier on your brain to remember this fairly long string of digits is to give you a short set of rules that you don't have to remember every single component. Can somebody help me find a short set of rules that I can associate with this string that you see here? Usually it takes somebody just a few seconds to come up with it, because I'm sure that you can detect the pattern. What is a short set of rules that I can use to replace that long string to something much smaller and more manageable?
Yeah, it's alternating zeros and ones.
Yes, exactly. It's alternating, and how many times?
10.
Looks like 10 times.
Yeah, exactly. So, but in 48 hours from now, I don't have to say, remember every single one. If I give you this short set of rules, notice how much easier I make it for your brain to take this away. Unfortunately, sometimes there is no short set of rules. Like if I wanted you to remember this string of digits in 48 hours, we have to work so hard where you remember every single component individually. There is no short set of rules. And sometimes I fear that in communication, we don't try hard enough to give somebody else's brain a short set of rules, to enable them to see the patterns, to remember them to see what is repeated, what is essential, and it is critical. We come back to that again and again. I purposefully chose this visual to show here in terms of taming complexity, this visual of a snail, because it reminds me of fractals. Are you guys familiar with fractals? Perhaps we may have addressed them last time that we talked. Fractals are these components that repeat themselves at any level of magnification. So for instance, next time you're at a grocery store, look at a head of a cauliflower. You'll see how the smallest head of cauliflower has the exact same properties as the full head of cauliflower. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at something very small, you're looking at something very large, it retains the same set of properties. There is cauliflower all the way down. So the principle that I hope that all of you will walk away with is, as you're thinking about something that is very complex and you want people to remember that complexity, make sure that you find a short set of rules, show them what's essential. The short set of rules for our presentation today: next time when you wonder how the brain makes decisions, remember that it does so by abiding by reflexes, habits, and goals. And as you're looking at my screen, if you want to take a picture of it, or I know that this is a recording, I've turned those guidelines into questions that you can ask yourselves. And I guarantee that as you link these questions to any of those 7 areas of focus, you will be able to convince your audiences to move in your favor. I am very grateful that you have invited me. Thank you so much. Please stay in touch. And I would love to join you again next time in the future. And please share with me some of your successes, because as you use these, a lot more people will move in your direction. Thank you so much, everyone.